Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Joseph Hyatt, standing in for Gayatri.
This week in 1938, the International Brigades staged their final parade down the Ramblas, wet with the tears of the Spanish people they had helped to defend. You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend, said La Passionaria, the iconic leader, Dolores Ibarruri.
Spanish dictator General Franco launched a military coup against the elected government in Madrid. He immediately received massive military support from Hitler and Mussolini. Other Western democracies didn't just stand idly by. It was far worse than that. They slapped an arms embargo on the government side, thus helping Franco.
Only Russia stood by Spain, and if the West had allied with Russia, World War II could have been averted and the whole course of human history altered. Joining us now to discuss the International Brigades is Jim Jump from the International Brigade Memorial Trust. Jim, you are the son of a member of the International Brigade. Your mother was a Spanish Republican. They married after meeting during the war. Obviously means a lot to you. It means a lot to me. I think it was our finest hour, and by our, I mean the left, internationally. But why should it matter to anybody else?
Well, it was, by any accounts, an extraordinary story. 2,500 people from the British Isles prepared to lay down their lives in a foreign war in what was then a distant country. 526 of them died and lie in unmarked graves on the battlefields of Spain. So we think these people, these 2,500 from Britain, and they were part of a much larger group of 35,000 volunteers from around the world, should, certainly the ones from Britain, should join the pantheon of our heroes of British Labour and working class progressive history, alongside people like the suffragettes, the Tolpuddle martyrs, the Chartists, people who fought for our rights, fought for democracy, fought against injustice, and did it moreover in the face of a hostile government at home.
Their contribution was greatly valued then. You heard me quoting from Dolores, the speech that she made of farewell actually moved me to tears again today, though I've read it 1,000 times when I was writing the script. Do Spanish people today remember them?
Oh yes, very much so. I mean, until recently, we had quite a few volunteers still with us, and we would return to Spain with them. And again, it would bring just the sight of these people who 75 or 70 years ago had risked their lives for the cause of Spain, would bring tears to the eyes of Spaniards. So they're very much remembered in Spain. Although it's still, the Spanish Civil War is still a contentious issue amongst some people in Spain, because although we had the transition to democracy after 1975 and the death of Franco, there was unfinished business, and Spain wasn't properly de-Francoized, if you like. So there are still elements in Spain and still in academia and in the political arena who contest what we accept as the version of what went on in the Spanish Civil War, and say, well, it was a fight between fascists and communists and they were both as bad as each other. Utter nonsense, of course. This was a fight between a democratically elected government and a fascist rebellion aided by Hitler and Mussolini. Most Spanish people know that, just as I hope most people in Britain and around the world know that.
Why are they still in unmarked graves? Can't the, or won't the Spanish state seek to discover the bodies? I mean, some of even their most famous writers, Lorca and others, are still missing.
Well,
dead, but missing.
This is a very controversial issue still in Spain. There's a popular movement called the movement for the recovery of historical memory in Spain, but that's very much made up of local groups. And the previous socialist government gave some limited support to this movement to take down the place names still named after Francoist generals, take down the statues to Franco and his allies, and to dig up and give a proper burial to the victims of Francoism, including the International Brigaders.
Tell us about your father was one of them. Tell us about the British battalion.
Well, the British battalion was formed soon after, well, late in 1936. Some 2,500 people served in it, mainly from Britain, Ireland, some from the Commonwealth, countries like New Zealand, Cyprus and Australia. They lost over 500 dead. They took part in all the major battles at Jarama, around Madrid, in Brunete, Teruel, in Aragon, and of course the Ebro, the final great battle of the war. They served with great distinction, but this is true of the whole Republican cause, they were scantily trained, very poorly equipped. They had no or a complete lack of armaments in many cases, lack of fuel, minimal air cover. So in many cases they were cut to shreds, and certainly in the first battle where they were blooded in Jarama, which was in a sense a victory in that it's prevented Franco from taking Madrid. Jarama is a valley to the southeast of Madrid. They suffered 150 deaths in just a couple of days fighting. They eventually held the line, and in that sense it was a heroic victory. And in fact, the great historian A.J.P. Taylor used to ask his students, where was the turning point in the fight against fascism in the 20th century? And people would say, the Battle of Britain or Stalingrad or El Alamein, and he'd say, no, it was at Jarama. It was at Jarama where it was first shown that fascism could be checked on the battlefield, and the British battalion played a leading role in that, just as it went on to fight in the other battles.
Now, the world remembers famous writers, Orwell, famous trade union leaders like Jack Jones, and many poets and scientists and great intellectuals. But of course, the great majority of the British battalion were working men. Tell us the kind of people they were.
That's right. Well, probably, it was, the point about the volunteers who went was they were a true cross-section of British society. So yes, there were some poets and Cambridge students and intellectuals and professionals, but they were a minority of perhaps 20%. Most, 80% were working class, what we would call working class people from the coalfields of South Wales or Scotland, the shipyards of the northeast and Clydeside, garment workers from the East End of London and Manchester. It was these sorts of people, or a lot of activists from of course this was we're talking about the Great Depression, the aftermath of the Great Depression, a lot of unemployed people, so activists from the unemployed workers movement also went. So those were the sort of people. They were in many ways the cream of their generation. Trade union activists, young, they were young men and women, obviously. Many those lucky enough to return went on to achieve great things, many of them. As you mentioned, Jack Jones, there was other great trade union leaders, Will Painter.
Hemingway was there.
Yes, we had poets, and we had a couple of people went on to become Labour MPs, artists, doctors, some people who became very accomplished doctors also cut their teeth on the battlefields of Spain.
Obviously, referencing to young people, it's very hard for us young people to comprehend the scale of this fascism back in that time, especially living in the democratic modern Europe we're in. But obviously, fascism remains prominent, doesn't it? We do see it existing, more so on social media nowadays, perhaps. But what would your message be to younger viewers as to how we can avoid such circumstance ever occurring again?
Well, Britain then in the 1930s had its own form of fascism. Fascism mutates, doesn't it? It takes many guises, but it's still the same beast. In the 1930s, we had Sir Oswald Mosley's black shirts, who were primarily anti-Semitic. In fact, the great battle of Cable Street, where Sir Oswald, the black shirts, tried to march through the mainly Jewish East End of London. Cable Street is called the Road to Spain. That took place in October 1936, and many of the people who fought there then went on to fight in Spain. And the great slogan of the protesters at Cable Street was "No pasarán." That was the slogan of the defenders of Madrid: "They shall not pass." So there's that direct link. This generation, these people who went to Spain, were the vanguard of that first generation to fight fascism. So they still inspire young people today. We know that in our organisation, the International Brigade Memorial Trust, we have more and more young people joining because they're inspired by that story. They know that their fight then in Spain and in the streets of Britain, because they'd been blooded in Britain, many of these volunteers, is the same fight that people have today. Of course, there's a wider international context as well. I mean, what happened in Spain took place against the backdrop of fascist militarism. We saw the rise of Hitler, annexation of Austria, Mussolini's pretensions to create an empire, his invasion of Abyssinia. All this was going on. So there's a wider international context, which tells us also about something about the Spanish Republic was a beacon of light for many people. Here, against that trend in the 1930s, here was a government set up in 1931, replacing a corrupt and out-of-touch monarchy that brought in, by our standards, it's quite a moderate program, but it built hundreds of schools. It gave equal rights to women.
By comparison with the British government, which presided over the Depression, as you say, it was a beacon of light. Just, we're only a couple of minutes. Am I right in saying that if the Western democracies had responded to Russia's call and stand for Spain, Hitler and Mussolini could have been defeated there, and the Second World War, unbelievably, actually might not have happened?
Well, of course, that's counterfactual, and people don't like to, or certainly historians don't like to go there, but we go there and we say, this is what the volunteers were saying at the time. They were saying, Britain and the rest of the world has an opportunity to stop fascism and Nazism in Spain. And that's why many of the volunteers went. I mean, you can read their memoirs and what they said at the time, that it was their chance to stop fascism and Nazism. And the British government didn't listen. They put, as others have said, they put their narrow class interests against the national interest. They didn't care about, or they were positively hostile to a progressive government in Spain, and preferred to cozy up to the fascist dictators in Europe, rather than to see that German and Italian fascist militarism was a threat to all mankind.
Jim Jump, I hope you get a good influx of members to the International Brigade Memorial Trust after this. Well, I'm quite hip and I can hop, but hip-hop is generally a genre too far for me. But I know a political hip-hop artist when I hear one. And we've got one, Marcel Cartier, coming up right after the break. Welcome back. On board the Sputnik today is New York rap artist Marcel Cartier, who recently relocated to London.
Rap is the language of the streets all over the world, but the language of rap seldom has the political power applied by Marcel. Not for him, the demeaning of women, the casual homophobia, the glorification of petty but deadly violence.
Marcel Cartier is a political rapper with a worldview on issues like Syria, Palestine, even divided Korea, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Marcel, welcome to London. Welcome to Sputnik. Your stuff is fantastic and fantastically political. That's not normal unless I've misgrasped the hip-hop genre. Much of it, as Joseph said in his introduction, is really not the kind of words, language, themes that I want to hear.
Well, I think the irony, actually, that we're having this conversation is that I was politicized through hip-hop. When I was 14, 15, 16 years old, I actually grew up in Europe. I was living on military bases, and hip-hop was, was a funky form of music. It was something that was enjoyable, but I started to dig a little bit deeper beyond the mainstream, and I started to listen to artists that had a lot of political overtones in their message. And through that, I began to question this dominant narrative that I had always been, instilled with, that, this greatness of the United States and its place in the world. And through that, began to, search on the World Wide Web and, try to understand concepts like, socialism and communism, and really just challenged my worldview and had to go through a very painful process of unlearning all of the nonsense that I had learned over the years. But I think that hip-hop is not something that's reactionary by its very nature.
No, of course.
I think that, like with any other form of culture, it depends, primarily on the society that you're living in. To paraphrase Karl Marx, the ruling ideas of it, each era are the ideas that are dominant among the ruling class. So of course, something like hip hop, which actually comes from one of the poorest communities in New York City, the South Bronx, and was really something that, you know, was about taking conditions of misery and trying to transform it, making something out of nothing. It's not really surprising that it would be co-opted by corporate America, that it's become now the most popular form of musical expression around the world. But when you turn on the radio or the TV in this country, or do the same in New York City, you'll have a lot of reactionary messages. And you'll actually have people that come from, you know, the artists I'm speaking of, they come from some of the most oppressed communities, but the message that they're putting out is the message of the oppressor, which is quite ironic. And, you know, as a result, I mean, I'm independent, so I own all of my music. But on the flip side of that, you're not gonna catch me at the Grammys, you know? Whereas other artists who have major label deals have essentially signed over their entire catalogs, the labels own them, and they may have some progressive ideas as well. But if, for example, one of those artists wanted to say something about Palestine, and we saw this recently, they'll be very quickly shut down, and they may very quickly actually say, you know what, I can't say this, or I didn't say it to begin with.
Yeah. Now, you've taken your art to some surprising places where I'm presuming hip-hop isn't so big as it is in London or in New York. Palestine, you've mentioned. You've been to Syria. You've even been to Korea. How did it go down there as a form?
Well, I mean, I don't think hip-hop is something that's very popular at all, perhaps not even known in North Korea. But it's such a powerful tool of expression that I felt the need to use it to talk about the Korean situation and hopefully reach a number of young people. I was actually a little bit nervous to put out this song that I have called Bomb Threat, because it was essentially contextualizing the Korean War. It was contextualizing the Korean situation and trying to add some political clarity to what's probably the most vilified and slandered country on the face of the planet. Now, I always tell my friends in New York City, or young people in general, that if you know the United States government does not do things that are in your interests, and your government that's attacking you is slandering countries around the world, perhaps those particular countries have actually done something that is a pathway towards human emancipation. So I visited North Korea. I was never more impressed with a society in my life. I came back realizing that I would actually have to not just make a song, but write loads to try to counter all of the nonsense that we're told about that country. And Bomb Threat was one of the ways in which I did that. And in hoping to, you know, break down barriers as well. I think that the way that we're taught and conditioned to think about North Korea says a great deal more about the effectiveness of our propaganda apparatuses than it does about North Korean propaganda.
Well, let's have a quick listen to the Bomb Threat.
Yeah, I'm turning on the news and I'm seeing all this conservative and liberal are yapping all that useless. Even most you leftists are spewing your excuses, talking all that noise. North Korea acting ruthless, imagining scenarios. Oh, they gon' nuke us. The truth is you got no context to your rumors. Backward positioning of who is the aggressor, who is on whose border with an arsenal of weapons, who controls the military of the country next to it, who is self-defending, who is acting negligent. They like to paint the North as a kingdom, prison camp. That is quite ironic when the #1 prison land is really my own country. U.S. in prisons more than any other country in world history before that you can't deny, and still I'm sure you'll try it. Reality is simple, Washington is the real tyrant. Korean conflict, yeah, it is a bomb threat. You got the sides wrong though, look how it started. Look at the facts, who suffered the hardest. 3 to 4 million.
Now, the leader's a young fellow. Did he hear it? Did he hear your art, do you think?
I don't think so. I'm hoping in the near future that may happen, and I think it is important to build those sort of bridges.
Well,
and
Dennis Rodman is an old friend of mine, and he's been going back and forward with what he calls basketball diplomacy. You could do the same with hip-hop.
That's right, and I mean, I am hoping to do something quite similar, actually. You know, this is one of the other things that impressed me so much about that particular society. You go into the Grand People's Study House in Pyongyang, they have plenty of English books, resources, and one of the main books that they said was so popular was a basically almanac of the National Basketball Association. So I thought perhaps Koreans may know Dennis Rodman, but that's about it. But when they wanted to start having conversations with me about Kobe Bryant and some of the other NBA stars, I was really surprised. And I was a little bit embarrassed almost to be from the United States, because like we know absolutely nothing but lies about their society, and they know so much more about our society.
But how can this be sustained if we look closer back to the UK? We saw the Smiths in the 80s standing up to the Iron Lady. We saw George Michael in the early 2000s standing up against the Iraq War. More recently in the London riots, we saw Plan B making a lot of music about this. These artists are far from one-hit wonders, their successes, but very much the points they make, and you reference the labels, hold them back. But I actually feel that young people are very disenfranchised in the political system in this country. We're seeing the likes of Russell Brand at the moment calling for a revolution, but how can that be sustained without these corporate ties, and how can it be managed?
Well, I think there has to be an interconnectedness between the cultural movement and the actual political movement, and I think that's what's been missing for such a long period of time. Often people will come to, quote-unquote conscious or militant revolutionary hip-hop shows. They'll put their fist in the air, they'll feel good about having come out, and that's where the action stops. They may go to an occasional demonstration, but here in the UK, as in the United States, this is not a revolutionary situation we're living in. It's not a pre-revolutionary situation. We're a long ways off. Myself, I'm a Marxist, and I understand that we're still reeling in a lot of ways from the collapse of the Soviet system and the socialist bloc. So we have to build this political movement as something completely connected with the cultural. Otherwise, there's loads of people who are great cultural workers and artists, but they may even fall off after a number of years if they feel demoralized that nothing's changing, that maybe their art's not doing very much to change the landscape. So I look at myself as a cultural worker, right? But I don't want it to just be that. It has to be something that feeds into the development of a movement that can actually fight for progressive change and for social justice.
But if you're a viewer of this show right now and you're inspired by what you're seeing, how can they take a step? How can a young person, you've got a smartphone, you've got your Facebook and Twitter, but what can you do beyond that with your talent to have an impact and to join this movement?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that can substitute for organization at the end of the day, whether that's a certain political party that you may want to, join or work with, the anti-war movement, which I think is something that is very much lacking, especially in the past few years. We did see some substantial protests against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but now that imperialism has seemingly shifted their strategy towards funding proxy armies and proxy wars, whether that's in Libya or Syria, the anti-war movement is quite weak because I think it's quite easy to come out and protest against a war when it might be your son or your daughter going off to fight, but when the people who are going to be doing the killing on behalf of the empire are, people in the countries that imperialism is trying to attack, then we don't see much of a movement in our capital cities. Last year, when they wanted to bomb the government of Bashar al-Assad, the ruling class couldn't quite get, or segments of the ruling class anyway that wanted to spearhead that, couldn't quite get it to go through. No, so I think they came back to the drawing.
The British Parliament.
That's right, that's right.
A majority of 13 votes.
Right, but now that it's ISIS that is supposedly the enemy and will be, receiving the bombs from, British or American planes. Now the public, as you said, is up for it. But I think it's actually a strategy at the end of the day to facilitate the same regime change operation that they've been trying to implement for the past 3.5 years. And they obviously had no problem funding ISIS before. Suddenly they get a little bit too close to Iraqi Kurdistan and they become the enemies, right? So I think, imperialism is a paper tiger, but it's also very deceptive, very manipulative, and it will try various strategies to try to hold on to power or to achieve its aims.
Paper tiger, but still got teeth. Marcel Cartier, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Joseph?
So, building on from the story on the International Brigades and their fight against fascism in Spain, we ask, could Hitler have been stopped before 1939? Well, our very own William Hague says Hitler could have been stopped before he started, but that wouldn't have ensured weapon makers huge profits. Hashtag follow the money. And of course, building on from Marcel, we're looking at hip-hop and politics. Do they go hand in hand? Can inspiring music artists impact the electorate and policy? Well, Aaron Makepeace says, absolutely. Music with political messages, or any message at all, is sorely lacking these days. Whilst Chris McNamee says, hip-hop has always been deeply rooted in politics, ever since Public Enemy told us to fight the power.
And the answer to all that, I'm afraid, is blowing in the wind.
That's all we got time for today, sir.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
Don't forget to tweet us, it's RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. But once again from me, it's Joseph Hyatt, it's goodbye.
And from me, George Galloway, it's been marvellous.